Hello and welcome to another episode of All Politics is Local. I'm your host, John Tian. All Politics is Local is a production of the Greater Blackstone Valley Democrats. For more information about the Greater Blackstone Valley Dems, feel free to visit our website at www.gbvdems.org. Tonight we have yet another great show for you. With me in the studio is my good friend Jim Miller for yet another return performance. Jim, thanks for coming on.
Oh, thank you for having me, John. Always a pleasure.
Great to have you here. Your insights into world politics are invaluable. A lot of my friends are telling me, a lot of my fans are telling me how much they love the episodes when you're on. And we have a lot to talk about tonight. A lot. In the wake of everything that's happened in Europe with the shootings and the bombings in Paris, with what's going on in Syria, new developments in the Ukraine, there is just a ton of stuff to get through. So we're just going to dive right in. Brett, I'd like to start off the show tonight. Here in the States, we have a lot of people who are complaining, especially on the right side of our political spectrum, who are saying that we should not allow any Syrian refugees into the country because there could be terrorists among them. And they're pointing to the passport that was left at the scene of one of the massacres in Paris. Whether that passport was actually one of the attackers or belonged to actually one of the attackers is really unknown at this point. It could have been a stolen passport that was left there as a false flag. We don't know. We don't know the truth of it. What we do know is that those attackers that have been identified so far were all European nationals. So I wanted to talk a little bit about American values. And Brett, if you could bring up Liberty 01 JPEG. American values are things like what we said with the Statue of Liberty. This is the plaque that exists at the base of the Statue of Liberty with the poem The New Colossus by Emma Lazarus. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here, at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Next image, Brett, thank you. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. And again, that was Emma Lazarus, The New Colossus. So my point in bringing this up is, if America doesn't stay true to its values, if we don't stay true to our principles of inclusion, all of the American values that we've exhibited through the years, if we don't stay true to those when the going gets tough, then they're not really values. Right? Jon Stewart said, they're not values, they're hobbies. And it's the truth. This is, we need to really take a step back and be braver than that, don't we?
A lot of people are looking at what happened in Paris, and for the second time in less than a year, and they're saying, wow, we are losing a war to ISIS. And we are absolutely losing a war to ISIS, but it's not on the battlefield. The United States has treated its values in particularly the Middle East. It upholds them when it wants, when it's convenient, and when it's not, it tosses them away. There's sort of this sense in American politics that the United States is deeply unpopular in the Middle East. And I've spent 5 years covering the Middle East. Before I was working on Russia, my main stories were first Iran, and then through my work in Iran, I began to cover Egypt and Syria. And we were talking about the Arab Spring before it was 2011, before the Arab Spring was happening. And the reality is that no, the United States is not deeply unpopular in the Middle East. In the Middle East, there are elements to the United States that the entire world looks up to. Our freedom of speech, the First Amendment is unparalleled in the entire world. It is the greatest law that has ever been written, and we take it for granted. And you go somewhere else, and
Excuse me.
and you won't take it for granted. I used to write for a publication in the UK. We were getting cease and desist letters from foreign countries because we translated letters, the article that activists wrote. It's ridiculous. But in the United States, that just never happens. As many enemies as my current publication has, and we have plenty, never gotten a cease and desist letter. The First Amendment, thank you. The United States is multicultural. We do not have laws that discriminate against individuals in theory. We have a society where you can come here, you can flourish. If you're a woman, you can have a job, you can drive a car. These things are worshipped in the Middle East, certainly by educated people, but also by just people in the streets. And this is one of those instances where the damage that is being done to the United States by the United States is, I cannot overstate it enough. This radical rhetoric, right now the entire country, if you go on Facebook, anybody with a Facebook account can go on and see the entire country lose its mind over 10,000 immigrants that aren't even here, that won't be here for maybe years.
Right.
In a country of 300 million.
Right.
That is just amazing, and the entire world is watching. And so, my Republican friends have made arguments along the lines of, we need to clamp down on Syrian refugees, or we need to ignore that quote because we're in a state of emergency that is going to make us less safe. But the reality is, no. The reality is we are so much less safe, even by hearing the rhetoric come out of some of these politicians' mouths. ISIS thrives on this.
Sure.
I mean, my boss, a guy by the name of Michael Weiss, he works for CNN, he works for the Daily Beast, and he just published a four-piece interview with an ISIS spy. This is a young man who we knew in 2012. He was an activist, then he became a rebel, and then he joined ISIS. And we were all very concerned that he joined ISIS. He knew reporters' names. He had all these contacts in the West. And this was a point in time where, by the way, my friends, people who I knew, people who Mike knew, were literally either going missing or being beheaded. I knew some of these guys we talk about on TV.
Right.
A man who I was supposed to stay in his house in Syria. He was shot twice in the chest by ISIS.
Right.
And I literally canceled my trip because of ISIS. So Mike interviewed this young man, and he talks about the sophistication and the appeal of the Islamic State. And one of the appeals is that they have law and order. They have, in a lawless society, they have law and order. And not just awful law and order. There's a great story, and it may or may not be true. I think it may be, though, of a man who got into a car accident with Abu al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS. But he didn't know it was the leader of ISIS.
Okay.
And he lost his patience with this guy. He was screaming at him. And Baghdadi said, "You're right. Let's go to the judge right now." And he took the man to the judge, and Baghdadi lost the case and paid the man right then and there. And then only afterwards
Did he
revealed
find out who he was?
who he was.
Yeah.
And now, would the guy have argued? He would have been an idiot to argue with
Sure.
Baghdadi.
Sure.
But the point is that the law applies. Well, that's the propaganda. Okay, that is the image. But what comes across is that the United States doesn't have that. We've consistently lied. about who our allies are and what we will do and what we will not do and who our enemies are. We created Al-Qaeda in Iraq by deposing Saddam Hussein.
Right, and releasing all the Baathists and basically taking away their jobs.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And now many of those, Sunnis who are very angry, the Shia are very angry. We have done no one a service in the Middle East in a generation. Everyone is angry with us. I mean, if you go back to, of course, they're angry with George Bush for creating this process, but they're very angry with Barack Obama.
Right, he's exasperated. He has certainly exasperated the situation. He hasn't done much good.
Absolutely. If you go to Egypt, when there were first protests in Egypt, Obama refused to stand with the protesters. Why? Because we have long-term strategic alliance with the Egyptian regime. But what's interesting is Obama went to Egypt and gave this pro-democracy speech that some activists pointed to, and they said, look, the United States wants us to protest.
That was when he was running for president, wasn't he? He did that big speech in Egypt,
And then boom. And then he turned their backs, and the Egyptian government was angry. Now the protesters were angry because the United States wouldn't come to their aid. Then what happens? When President Mubarak was on the verge of resigning, Obama turned his back on him, and the Saudis and the Egyptian military, who now hates us, everybody was angry. We've consistently pursued this, where we don't stick by allies, but then we also don't condemn them for the human rights abuses that
we seem almost arbitrary and capricious, and it's not a good situation at all for us to find ourselves in. Yeah.
So Carl Bildt, who is the former leader of Sweden, he sent a tweet today and said the United States is debating 10,000 refugees in Syria. But over the next 2 years. But my little tiny country takes in that amount every 3 weeks.
Right.
Okay, and we're talking legal refugees. Now, what's happened is that the United States and Europe have not acted. There has not been a strategy. Syria is a mess, and we've allowed that to happen. We've allowed Russia to sell weapons to Assad or supply the Assad regime. The Assad regime has done the overwhelming vast majority of the killing. The refugees, when you interview the refugees, some of them mention ISIS, not all of them, because ISIS isn't in most of Syria. Most of Syria is absent of ISIS.
Right, and Assad is dropping barrel bombs on his own population.
Absolutely.
He's making a real mess of things over there. He caused a lot of the unrest. People talked about the recent Democratic debate where Bernie Sanders actually linked climate change to acts of terrorism. Arguably, the civil war in Syria can be traced to a long drought that really can't be explained by simple variations in climate. It's very much climate change related.
I understand what Bernie was saying, and I agree with him, actually. That what's happening in the Middle East is definitely the result of long-term economic struggles, and some of them certainly link back to water.
Yeah.
Jordan is literally running out of water. I think, though, his refusal to answer the question beyond climate change, because if Bernie Sanders becomes president, unless he's Merlin, climate change is not going to end tomorrow. So you need an answer to ISIS that doesn't involve reducing the temperature of the planet, which we can't do.
We can't do just yet.
So, I would like to have fewer terrorist attacks and fewer deaths. But I guess this is to go back to the central point. We are being asked to betray our values while simultaneously making us less safe.
Right.
The refugee process. ISIS is not going to use the refugee process to get to the United States to conduct attacks.
Right. And Brett, if we could bring up vetting process .jpg just to take a look at what the vetting process really does look like. So here's our vetting process for refugees. Refugees apply for resettlement at American embassies or through the United Nations. If they pass that first hurdle, they are screened by outposts of the Department of State all over the world. They undergo investigations of their biography and identity, FBI biometric checks of their fingerprints and photographs, in-person interviews by Department of Homeland Security officers, medical screenings, as well as investigations by the National Counterterrorism Center and by American and international intelligence agencies. The process may take as long as 3 years, sometimes longer. No other person entering America is subjected to such a level of scrutiny. On the other hand, European nationals, like the people who perpetrated the Paris attacks, can go to the American embassy, and for $14 they can get a visa waiver and come here for 90 days, no questions asked.
Yes. So first I could say that in the entire history of the refugee program, there's not been a single refugee that has ever conducted an act of terrorism. By the way, that's not just for the United States. Journalists have been searching for records of refugees committing terrorism. It just hasn't happened.
Right.
Okay? But let's talk about it rationally. Let's talk about if you were ISIS, and we know a lot about how ISIS operates. If you were ISIS, why would you put an operative through a process that takes up to 3 years, during which they are being scrutinized, their electronic activity is being scrutinized, their movements are being scrutinized? You simply would not do that. Now, in this interview that I mentioned earlier, where we were interviewing this ISIS spy, my boss was interviewing this ISIS spy, he talks about the fact that first of all, most fighters in ISIS, in Syria, are not Syrians. That is just a fact. Okay, most of them are foreign fighters.
Yep.
Now, beyond that, ISIS has begun to tell foreign fighters in certain countries, don't come here. Be ISIS in your country. And that is in part because ISIS, for a very long time, had a military monopoly. No one was really challenging them. And then U.S. airstrikes, they were kind of a joke. But in the last, say, 6 months or so, it's not really a joke anymore. And ISIS has had some real problems, and they're fighting pitched battles against ground troops, but they're not our ground troops, although apparently some of our ground troops are involved in that fighting. They're mostly Kurdish ground troops.
Right, the Peshmerga.
The
right?
Peshmerga, and they're doing a great job, but they're also not part of a permanent solution. No, sorry, I don't want to be on record as saying that. They're absolutely part of a permanent solution. They're not the entirety of a permanent solution, because a Peshmerga military that is unchecked will cause the next civil war. As just. And you can we could spend a whole episode on that, and you could debate whether the Peshmerga is a good thing or a bad thing, but the bottom line is it's complicated, and you need a bigger solution in order to avoid the next civil war, which I think would be nice, because these civil wars don't stay civil. They don't stay localized. We're so far beyond that. This is a global war. You cannot have Syria, the center of the Middle East, the crossroads of the world, decay like this.
Before we go on, I was remiss earlier. I forgot to mention your position and where people can find some of your work, and especially where people can find this 4-part series, the interview with the ISIS spy. So.
Yes. So again, my name is James Miller. I am the managing editor for a magazine called The Interpreter. You can go to interpretermag.com. The Interpreter follows Russia and Russia's foreign policy. So right now we're talking a lot about Russia's domestic politics, but also Ukraine and Syria. And we've followed those conflicts very, very closely. Now, before this, I was working for another small magazine out of England that focused on the Arab Spring primarily, and Iran before that. But my main subject was Syria. My boss, Michael Weiss, my boss at The Interpreter, this is a strange intersection of stories, because he was sort of a Russian expert before the Arab Spring. but he was writing about Syria for all these major news outlets, and he has a New York Times best-selling book on ISIS. He's the co-author. The other author is one of my other most respected journalists, a man by the name of Hassan, Hassan Squared, he likes to call himself. And Hassan is a rather remarkable man because he's from Al-Bukamal. And Al-Bukamal is a small town in Syria that no one would care about except for maybe like Hassan and some other people, except that Al-Bukamal was the first town that ISIS took over in Syria. And while it's certainly smaller than some of the other cities that we talk about as being ISIS strongholds, Al-Bukamal plays this key role in ISIS. And so Al-Bukamal, I remember it fondly when I was covering pro-democracy protests. These were not radical people. They were pro-democracy. Major themes in protests there were that, we were non-sectarian. We're not against the Shia. We're not against the Christians. We're not against the Kurds. That this is about democracy and economic opportunity. And now it's the headquarters of ISIS. And there's plenty of people there who just this week, we believe, we don't know what happened to him, but there's film of a young protester protesting against ISIS. We believe he is dead. So there's still people who are brave enough to protest against ISIS in these places. These are the people who are fleeing.
Right.
The people who are seeking
People who are being
refuge.
oppressed.
The people who are being oppressed.
Right.
ISIS is not going to apply through these processes. Now, that does not mean that we don't need the very high levels of security. But let's be honest. Today, the House voted to add a series of protocols to this process that would make the FBI director, like the human being who directs the FBI, personally sign off on 10,000 refugees. Now, I hope to God that the FBI director is too busy to do that. The FBI director said today, condemned the law, which is very rare to have an FBI director comment
Weigh in on
any
any matter of law.
matter of law,
Legislation, yeah.
condemned the law, and said it's completely unrealistic.
Yeah.
It's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
And
they also want the Secretary of State, too, don't they?
they want this. There were three agencies: the FBI, the Secretary of State, someone else. I don't remember.
Maybe the Department of Homeland Security or...
But it was the directors.
Right.
Are going to sign off on 10,000 refugees.
Right. And guarantee that they will not be terrorists.
Yeah, which is impossible
Right.
because we certainly can't guarantee our own civilians are not going to be terrorists.
Right.
We can't guarantee our own soldiers are not going to be terrorists. We can't guarantee that the people who are running security for our CIA offices in places like Afghanistan are not going to be terrorists. It is, and this is certainly, I'm not condemning the U.S. military or this. No, it is a completely unrealistic and it's an odd focus. This is just playing politics.
Right, and again, it's damaging to our international reputation and our credibility in the world.
Yes.
It's ludicrous that we're going through this. We've covered a lot of ground already, but you did begin to discuss at least a little bit of the geography of Syria with your Abu Kamal. We talked. Beautiful. So here is a map of Syria, and this actually talks about where the Russian strikes in Syria are happening. I don't see Abu Kamal on the map. The gray area there is the area that's controlled by ISIS, but it perhaps is too small of a town to actually list.
Yeah, it's too small of a town to actually list. But if you see Deir ez-Zor, which is way over on the right,
yeah, just above the key,
it would be to the southeast of that,
okay.
Pretty close to the Iraq border. And so what's interesting about this map, if we could keep it up for a minute, is that Russia has said that it's this partner in combating ISIS, but actually, mostly it's not hitting ISIS. Mostly it is hitting rebels in the northwest. There you see, and now around Damascus and south of Damascus in the southwest, and the rebels that Russia is hitting, they're actually Western-backed groups. So these are groups that the CIA has trained, that the CIA has equipped with TOW anti-tank weapons.
Okay.
And these groups have been very effective in launching an offensive and capturing Assad territory in Idlib province and in Latakia. And Latakia is the stronghold of the Assad regime.
Okay.
It's also where Russia is supplying Assad with helicopters, with tanks, with ammunition, and things of this nature. So what's happening is that these rebels have been trying to carve out a space where their civilian populace is safe. And there used to be ISIS in parts of that Idlib province. You see that big patch of yellow
Right.
in the northwest.
Yep.
There used to be ISIS there, and ISIS was kicked out. So for a period of time, and I have a lot of contacts in a town called Kaframbo in Idlib province, and these were really inspiring pro-democracy activists who turned around one day and discovered that they had their own little country. But it had no running water, it had no electricity, it had no government, it had no police, and it had no military. And this and they had no schools. They had nothing.
Right.
And so basically, these activists figured out how to survive, how to literally, survive. And but what happened was that they were constantly being bombed. Everything that they were doing was being bombed by the Assad regime. And the Syrian rebels were really unable to prevent that because they don't have the kinds of anti-aircraft weapons that would be needed. And by the way, no one has ever advocated giving them the anti-aircraft weapons that would be needed because anti-aircraft weapons are bad in the wrong hands.
Right.
And so so they had to develop an early warning system. So what they did was they figured out, just going on the internet, how to build a radio. And they built a radio that was big enough to broadcast to the entire town and beyond, and to the suburbs. And they got shortwave radios, and they were all operating on different frequencies. So they had to figure all this out, and they put spotters all around who would call in airstrikes. And as they developed the system of doing it, they suddenly turned around and realized, we have a radio station, but mostly it's dead air. So let's start doing programming. And so they started to do programming first to discuss local politics, because now they're doing what we're doing.
All politics is local.
But the difference is, if you and I, didn't do this show anymore, there would still be a government in Milford, but there was no government in
Right.
Kaframbo.
Right.
So they had to start to discuss, and the issues they were discussing were, how do we get the lights on? How do we pay for things? How do we import food? How do we grow our own food? How can we need generators. We need oil for the generators. Where do we get this stuff? They had to figure out how to make a civilization on their own. It's kind of like Walking Dead type stuff.
Yep. Yep.
And so, but then they were like, well, now we still have this radio station. Let's talk about what should the role of women be in society, and let's have programs for men and women on this topic.
Okay. Yep.
Now let's have educational. Let's have PBS. Let's have
Okay,
let's have educational programming for when the kids are out of school.
Right.
Oh, and by the way, they had to develop schools too.
Of course. Yeah.
So they did all these things, and then what happened is in 2014, ISIS rolled in. 2013 and 2014, ISIS came in, and ISIS didn't like any of these things, and ISIS was in a power struggle against the civilians, and the civilians, the rebels who were there, are mostly defectors from the Assad regime, and these are moderate guys. They didn't set out to start a revolution, but they were fighting one.
Right.
But as far as they were concerned, they weren't sure what to do with ISIS, because even if they didn't like ISIS, what gives us the authority to, fight ISIS or to tell them no or whatever? And there's certainly risks involved, but there was also this unwillingness to challenge them. And what happened was the civilian activists had to convince the rebels to push ISIS out, and that's what eventually happened. And Raid Faris, who is this very famous man, he was behind a lot of these initiatives. And he was also, every Friday, he would make banners with another artist. And the banners were in English and Arabic.
Okay.
And they always related to the news of the day. And his goal was to tell the world what the Syrian people actually thought about what was going on in the world. And these banners are very, very famous, and a lot of people have written about them, and I've written about them. And I've seen some of them, and I've touched some of them. And one of the more famous ones that might be familiar to some people is they wrote condolences to Boston after the Boston Marathon bombing.
Okay. Yep.
But these protests were being bombed. So these are the guys, they were protesting while the Assad regime was still in control, and they were being shot at. And then the rebels kicked the Assad out, and they were protesting, and the protests were being bombed. And then they set up these radio stations and the civil society from scratch, and ISIS came in. And then ISIS killed some of them and imprisoned some of them. And I know Raid came here in January of 2014, and he was very proud. He had finally convinced the rebels to stand up to ISIS. And, you know, I had been talking to Raid for years about coming to Syria. He said, you have to see it, you have to see it. It's incredible. What we're doing here is incredible. And 3 days after we had that conversation, he returned to his hometown, and an ISIS sympathizer shot him twice in the chest. He's a tough guy. He lived.
Okay.
But ISIS has been kicked out. These are the people. Kafram Bel has had, I think, 2 hospitals now bombed. The ambulances were also bombed. They bombed the ambulances the day before they bombed the hospital.
Wow.
So, the first responders are being hit. So they're being bombed. Oh, by the way, sorry, bombed by Russia. This is recent. This is in the last month and a half. Okay,
Wow.
so these are the people Russia is bombing. Russia's bombing the activists. Russia's bombing the hospitals. But Russia's bombing the rebels who stood up to Assad and who stood up to ISIS, who are making positive ground.
Right.
So
and they're not doing so much against ISIS. Now,
they're not doing so much against ISIS.
Didn't ISIS claim responsibility for that airliner?
Yes,
that was
so
bombed?
very interesting. Airliner was shot down on October 31st. That was a long time ago. It's now November.
Well, it wasn't shot down, it was brought down.
Brought down. Oh, yeah, excuse me. And there was no, nothing. No one said for sure that it was terrorism or whatever. And this was the longest. It took 3 days before the UK first said it was terrorism. And then the US said it was terrorism after that. And that was the longest it took for any civilian airliner to be brought down, and for a reason, at least whether or not terrorism was known, that took the longest.
Right.
That was terribly stated, but I think you understand what I mean. And but yet, it wasn't until 2 days ago or 3 days ago now
That the Russians
finally admitted it.
Right.
So then Russia comes out with this big thing. Oh well, we're going to up our anti-ISIS campaigns, and they have. But still, even in the last several days, most of the airstrikes were against these rebels. They had nothing to do. So the thing is, Russia's entire strategy in Syria is not to fight ISIS. It's to support the Assad regime. It's been that way since 2011, and now it's that way directly militarily. So when we talk about, we should partner with Russia to fight ISIS, that would require an entire change of the entire scope of the mission for Russia. It's never going to happen.
Right, and the Russians, I mean, they've been in favor of Assad since his father was in power.
That's correct.
Right,
That's
Hafez Assad was Bashar's father.
That's correct.
And they've been on his side.
Yeah.
For 40 years.
Now, there's other reasons why Assad cannot be part of the solution. And the first reason is that Assad cannot possibly win militarily. Russia is dropping firepower that Syria has never seen before. I talked to activists who have been bombed for years, okay? Bombs go off while I'm on the phone with them, and they don't even blink.
They don't even
And
flinch.
I say, was that a bomb in the background? Probably.
Probably.
Just like a truck going by in the background in our background. Okay? And yet, these people frightened by the scale and the power of these Russian airstrikes. And yet, Assad regime that has brand new fighters from Iran. They were there before, but now they're there in much greater numbers. New Iraqi militias, that's brand new. And a new wave of Hezbollah fighters are all fighting for the Assad regime with these Russian airstrikes. They've won one victory and they've lost ground elsewhere.
Wow.
They've lost ground in the areas that Russia is attacking. Okay?
Uh-huh.
So there is no scenario where Assad wins militarily, where he ends the war. ISIS will continue until that war is over.
Right.
That's just it. So Assad can't win the war, so Assad has to go.
Now, there was some conversation this morning around, I think the Russian ambassador said that there is no scenario where Assad goes away, while our Department of State, and in fact even John Kerry, was saying Assad clearly has to go. So it's kind of a, where are we with this?
Right.
But it certainly seems like Assad can't stay.
The Russians have been playing this game, and they've been doing it since 2011, that says we're not married to the idea of Assad. But, he needs to be part of, or his government needs to be part of this mythical transitional political process.
Right.
And everybody wants a mythical political transitional process, except for one person, and that person is Bashar al-Assad, who has refused to engage in any sort of diplomacy. Now, lately, what's been happening is that the Russians have been sort of giving the hint that they're open to a renewal of this political process. And Russia is trying to present itself in the international theater as this
As the negotiator,
negotiator in chief, the chief diplomat, the compromiser,
the entity that can bring this about, that's going to make this happen.
That's right.
Yeah, that's how they're trying to sell themselves. Interesting to see whether or not that works.
Yeah, well, and so today Assad said that he's not interested in early elections. He's not interested in any of the things that even Russia said that it was negotiated.
Okay.
So, but Russia's known this all along. This is
Right.
the thing. Russia's not stupid. And by the way, they're okay with this. Every time every time promises are made on behalf of the Syrian regime, and Russia says, yeah, this is great, and the United States, well, we're kind of skeptical. And then Assad says, nah, forget about it. Well, you would think Russia would get angry, but they don't.
Right.
Because this is part of the game that is played.
They're playing. Yep.
Because as long as the United States and other countries are talking about, this upcoming conference where we're going to talk about peace in Syria, and maybe something will come, as long as that conversation is happening, then the conversation of it's time to take down Assad, we should have a conference where we build a coalition to take down Assad, those conferences never happen. And so now we're at a point where there is now a very strong Russian military presence in northwest Syria.
Right.
We have Iran, and we have Hezbollah, and we have Jabhat al-Nusra, and we have ISIS, and we have the Free Syrian Army, and we have Jaish al-Fatwa. We have all these groups.
In fact, I have a graphic that really illustrates this. Brett, if you could find Tangled Web for us, and we can continue talking about it while he looks for it. Unfortunately, I gave Brett he brought it right up. Good
That's
job, Brett.
fantastic.
There's the tangled web in the fight for Syria's future. This graphic is actually out of date. It's about a year old, and we don't have Russia in there.
Yeah.
But look at the mess that it was before Russia got in there. And now France is in there too, right? France is dropping bombs.
There is a coalition, and it was shrinking for a while. What was interesting was when the United States started its air campaign against ISIS in 2014, the United States was doing about 65% of the bombings. And as of a month ago, we were doing 95% of the bombings. So what was happening is the coalition was falling apart because there is no clear anti-ISIS strategy. And the coalition was basically saying, well, why are we going to risk our airplanes, our fighter pilots, our lives, our reputations for a losing mission? now France has really seriously stepped up efforts, and so is the United States. So that could be changing.
France is actually looking to get NATO involved. They've declared it an act of war, and they're really looking to land on ISIS pretty hard.
So you know what's interesting about France is, they sort of get made fun of in the United States for, France surrendered everything.
Yeah, the
right?
cheese-eating surrender monkeys,
Yeah.
right? That's yet more rhetoric that I detest from our political process. But,
It's always fun to poke fun at someone. But the thing about it is, actually, I read this great article about French intervention. When France intervened, like when we intervene, we start off by sending like 2 monitoring robots, and then we upgrade to like 2 killing robots.
Mm-hmm.
When France intervenes, they intervene, and they don't lose. They have this history of just like very strong, very fast, very effective counterterrorism operations.
Mm-hmm.
And but the thing is that everybody is sort of coming to the conclusion is that you need a ground force. You need a force on the ground to really fight ISIS. And no one wants that to be the United States.
Right.
The United States doesn't want it. I mean, we could take a poll. I'm willing to get that you at home, you don't want the United States. That doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. But the United States doesn't want it. I heard the head of the Peshmerga, the Kurdish forces in northern Iraq, gave an interview the other day. He said, we don't want U.S. soldiers, which is not entirely true, but I'll get to that in a minute. The Free Syrian Army doesn't want it. The Russians certainly don't want it.
Right.
No one wants it. But there are other options. But what are your other options? Special forces units to be advisors, to be trainers, absolutely. But we shouldn't kid ourselves. We had an American serviceman killed just 2 or 3 weeks ago now.
2 or 3 weeks ago, yeah, in Syria.
It was the first time since the drawdown from Iraq that we've had a casualty, and he was supposedly a trainer or an advisor. Well, this is just what kind of training and advising are you doing
when you're in a firefight?
When you get shot.
Right.
So we shouldn't kid ourselves. They may not be the front lines, but they're definitely fighting. And I think it's kind of a crime, frankly, that we have handfuls of soldiers basically kind of fighting a war by themselves.
Right.
I mean, this is not an effective policy. It's not fair to the soldiers who are doing it. So we need some sort of ground force. Who is that going to be? And it could be these Free Syrian Army rebels who have been fighting ISIS. They've been fighting Assad. But the problem is the administration has said repeatedly so far that we're willing to train Syrian rebels to fight ISIS, but not Assad. And which is just so the lack of understanding of the situation on the ground. No one is going to sign up for that.
Right.
You have to do it as a package. And, so by putting this off, and by the way, so right now I'm beating up on Obama a little bit, but Marco Rubio is one of the people who voted against bombing the Assad regime in 2013. Mm-hmm. And now Rubio's given these speeches about how Obama let, Syria fall apart. Well,
Sure.
Excuse me, Mr. Rubio. As a matter of fact, there were only 2 Republicans that voted for that measure in the Foreign Armed Services Committee, and all the other Republicans voted against it. So, including Mr. Rubio.
Right.
So, I heard Jeb Bush speak earlier today, or I saw a video of him speak earlier today, and he basically said, Obama's not doing enough. What do we need to do? Well, we need to selectively arm rebels and support the Peshmerga and do airstrikes, which is literally exactly what we are doing.
Right.
But then Jeb adds, but we need to sort of add this like religious test, basically,
Right.
for these refugees. We've already talked about that issue. But but this is just, that is like the soft version, and maybe we need to talk about the hard version of the racism. We haven't actually gotten
We
there.
haven't even gotten to that.
But that's like the soft version of the racism is to say, that, well, we should just pause this program because it's unsafe. Well, we should have, maybe just focus on the Christians. Well, first of all, there's a group called the Yazidis, and Yazidis are monotheists, but they're a bit odd. I mean, odd and unique. They're not Christian, they're not Jew, they're not Muslims, and they're never mentioned in the media, amazingly. But they are being butchered by ISIS. ISIS has a degree of respect for Shia Muslims, even though they consider them to be enemies.
Right, and that's why ISIS blew up Beirut.
Yeah.
The day before they went to Paris.
Yeah, absolutely. But they treat the Yazidis like dogs, and entire villages of Yazidis have gone missing because ISIS is kidnapping them and doing all sorts of things that are not appropriate to talk about on this television station. But the worst imaginable war crimes are being committed against the Yazidi people. We never hear about that. In fact, Christians in Syria are not geographically located in areas where ISIS is currently active. So now that is not to say that ISIS has done awful things to Christians.
And that's not to say that Christians won't be refugees.
Absolutely.
Right.
But the majority of ISIS's crimes are against fellow Sunni Muslims, Yazidis, Kurds, and Shia Muslims. Other minority groups, there are other minority groups. The Druze are in Syria, but they're in southwest Syria where they've received a degree of protection from both the Free Syrian Army and the Assad regime, although more and more of them are starting to come along to the rebel cause. So there are other groups that deserve at least as much protection or more, but, even non-Muslim groups. But apparently Jeb Bush just doesn't care about those
He wants to bring the
people.
Christians in. We've only got about 10 minutes left, so let's get back to the United States. Let's talk a little bit. I did spend some time today on some graphics about George Takei and the remarks by the mayor of Roanoke, Virginia. Brett, if you could bring up Takei 01. And as I read these, Brett, if you don't mind, just switch right to the next one because this is kind of long, but I really wanted to get George's points out. George famously was Commander Sulu on the Starship Enterprise. He has, in his old age, become very politically active. George does some great stuff. This was his statement on Facebook this morning about the mayor of Roanoke, Virginia. Earlier today, the mayor of Roanoke, Virginia, Mr. David A. Bowers, in the attached letter, joined several state governors in ordering that Syrian refugees not receive any government assistance or be relocated to their jurisdiction. Apart from the lack of legal authority to do so, under the Refugee Act of 1980, only the president has authority to accept or deny refugees. His resort to fear-based tactics and his galling lack of compassion for people fleeing these same terrorists, Mayor Bowers made the following startling statement. And Brett, if you could go to TTO2, there it is. That's the full statement on the left. Unfortunately, you couldn't read most of it, but he said in that third paragraph, I'm reminded that Franklin D. Roosevelt felt compelled to sequester Japanese foreign nationals after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And it appears that the threat of harm to America from ISIS now is just as real and serious as that from our enemies then. That's really a disgusting comment, and George took him to task. Mayor Bowers, there are a few key points of history you seem to have missed. One, the internment, not a sequester, was not of Japanese foreign nationals, but of Japanese Americans, 2/3 of whom were U.S. citizens. I was one of them, and my family and I spent 4 years in prison camps because we happened to look like the people who bombed Pearl Harbor. It is my life's mission never to let such a thing happen again in America. 2, there was never any proven incident of espionage or sabotage from the suspected enemies then, just as there has been no act of terrorism from any of the 1,854 Syrian refugees the U.S. has already accepted. We were judged based on who we looked like, and that is about as un-American as it gets. It goes back to your point earlier about there was no act of terrorism from any of these refugees.
That's correct.
And three, if you were attempting to compare the actual threat of harm from the 120,000 of us who were interned then to the Syrian situation now, the simple answer is this: there was no threat. We loved America. We were decent, honest, hard-working folks. Tens of thousands of lives were ruined over nothing. And finally, Mayor Bowers, one of the reasons I am telling our story on Broadway 8 times a week in Allegiance is because of people like you. You, who hold a position of authority and power, but you demonstrably have failed to learn the most basic of American civics or history lessons. So Mayor Bowers, I am officially inviting you to come see our show as my personal guest. Perhaps you too will come away with more compassion and understanding. Eloquent statement from George Takei. I really admire him, and I admire the work that he's doing.
You know, I have a lot of Iranian friends, and many of them, their families at least, came here in the 80s. And, you know, I mean, what happened in Iran was awful. You know, the Islamic Republic took over, and Iran went from this sort of vibrant Western-style democracy to, well, let me just move on. There were plenty of problems with the Shah, but a Western-style society to this just terrible dictatorial, just the worst types of things. Americans were taken hostage, and there was a real state of fear. We accepted so many Iranian refugees. And those people, you know, they're very hardworking, very educated, very smart, very nice people, who, by the way, really helped us develop our understanding of and our strategy for how to deal with the Iranian regime. You know, the people who are fleeing are just the people who are fleeing. The worst people are the ones who aren't fleeing. You know, I already pointed out it doesn't make any sense for ISIS to go through this process to send refugees. You know, the reality is we missed a key opportunity here. Instead of pushing them away or saying some of the horrible things, horrible, monstrous things that people like Ben Carson called refugees rabid dogs today.
Yes. Yeah.
Donald Trump opened the door to having Muslims sign up for like identity cards.
Right.
Okay.
A database or some way to identify them. Perhaps he'd like to sew a crescent onto all their clothing, much like the Germans did with the Star of David.
You know, I hate the German analogies, but never in the, and I'm going to say this, never in my lifetime has a German analogy ever been so appropriate.
Right.
Adolf Hitler came to power through this exact mechanism.
This exact sort of demagoguery and
populism,
yep.
demagoguery, and blaming others for and
scapegoating.
fear-mongering, scapegoating, and just radical statements. And I don't think it could happen. I think the Constitution protects it. But the fact that so many Americans are listening to this message is horrifying.
Yep.
It really hurts us, and we missed the opportunity because we could have turned around and said, no, you know what? We're going to accept a lot of refugees.
Right.
And the Syrian people would have said,
wow. Much like the French President Hollande. He increased the number of Syrian refugees he wants to bring into France.
That's correct.
Yeah. And Jay Inslee, Washington, he's welcoming Syrian refugees. Governor Malloy in Connecticut today. Governor Mike Pence in Indiana decided to turn away two families of Syrian refugees.
Yes, he did.
That were
Little
slated
kids.
to come to his state. Little kids. He turned them away. Governor Mike Malloy welcomed them to Connecticut today.
And the thing about it is, too, okay, if terrorists come here through refugee, first of all, again, the United States government at the federal level gets to decide that. But you think just because they settle in Rhode Island that somehow they can't find a way to get into into Massachusetts or wherever they are?
Right.
Okay. What is Charlie Baker going to deploy the National Guard to check? Traffic is already bad enough, Charlie, on 95.
Right,
okay.
Right.
So please don't even give me that. It doesn't make any sense.
None whatsoever.
It's pure politics of the ugliest kind.
Brett, if you could pull up poll 1939, that JPEG. This is the attitude of Americans towards Jewish refugees in 1939. In January 20th, 1939, should the U.S. government permit 10,000 mostly Jewish refugee children to come in from Germany? 30% said yes, 61% said no, 9% held no opinion. Anne Frank was among them.
Yes, she was.
Who amongst my viewership, who in this country has not read The Diary of Anne Frank? Anne Frank was among those whose family applied for refugee status in the United States. Had she been granted that, she might well be an author living in Boston.
And I'll tell you what, she would have been a pretty pro-American author.
Yeah.
And this is the thing, you know, besides, and I know there's a humanity that obviously affects me, but, you know, we need to look at the hard facts. That if we want to defeat ISIS, we need to promote American ideology. You know, ISIS's ideology isn't just about radical Islam. As a matter of fact, this is something that comes out of studying ISIS a lot. Radical clerics have neither played a particularly important role in developing ISIS nor in combating it. Islam isn't the battlefield here, it's ideology.
Right.
You know, actually, there's some fairly radical Muslim groups that are fighting ISIS. It's ideology. But there's also some very moderate groups, or you might say not even non-religious groups that are fighting ISIS. So, you know, it's about, you know, values, and the United States has, frankly, not just on this issue, but on pretty much every issue. We've done nothing. We've made things worse. Then we've refused to take the refugees. It's time to stop. You know, in order to fight terrorism, we have to stop the silliness. You know, this politics is just making us more unsafe and more confused and more angry and wasting so much energy. Look at all the energy we wasted on 10,000 refugees. We are not one iota closer today than we were yesterday or the day before to actually defeating ISIS, either on the battlefield or through ideology.
Or ideologically. You've been watching All Politics is Local. All Politics is Local is a production of the Greater Blackstone Valley Democrats. For more information about the Greater Blackstone Valley Dems, feel free to visit our website at www.gbvdems.org. Thanks for tuning in. Good night, everybody.